It's a new day, but not on DS9. We're in a house during a storm, and one with a photo of Season 4 era Sisko and Jake, judging by the shaven head. The house is occupied by an elderly gentleman who injects himself in the neck with something before turning to the camera and revealing he's Tony Todd. Not in this episode, though. In this one, he's Jake Sisko, at least according to the stranger who knocks on his door. After being invited in and treated for a scratch, she admits she's not here by accident, having sought him out. Old Jake here is a writer, you see, and she adored his books, so much so that she needed to come and ask him why he only ever published 2 before he switched to scientific research, of all things. Something about today has put him in a talkative mood, and he explains that it's a long story, one involving the death of his father, and one that began with him being dragged along on a trip that he didn't really want to go on. Jake would rather have been working on the short story he was writing, but the wormhole was going to do a science wibbly that it only does once every 50 years, and Sisko thought it was worth watching. Either the wormhole had other ideas, or they were too close when it started wibbling, the result being their warp core having a bit of a tantrum. Sisko popped down there to check it out, and Jake followed, despite being told to stay put. That means he was there when the warp core did a wibbly of its own and spat out some lightning, hitting them both. Jake was thrown clear, though his dad wasn't quite so lucky, and faded away. The memorial service helped everybody move on, everybody except Jake, that was. Others tried to take care of him, and even Quark gave Eggnog some time off to provide a distraction, but there's not really a lot that'll help when you've lost your last anchor and are left drifting. You can imagine his surprise then when he was woken up by a flash one night to see his father lying against a chair, only to watch him fade away again. Old Jake tells his guest that Dax did all of the expected science bollocks things to his room just to make sure, and before concluding that it must have been a nightmare. Life went on, though, along some very troubling paths. The recent Klingon occupation of some Cardigan colonies got Bajor worried they'd be next, so they entered a defensive alliance with their former oppressors. Naturally, that made DS9 a prime target if the Klingons decided to start shit again, so most people scarpered while they could. Jake wasn't one of them, despite the urging of Kira and Worf. To be fair, his instincts were on the money as his dad reappeared once more. This one was different, and we managed to get him to the infirmary for tests and the like. The word temporal was bandied around, placing them firmly in time-fuckery territory. For Sisko, the last thing he remembered was fiddling with the warp core on the Defiant, despite a year passing for everybody else. The science bollocks answer was warp wibblies pulling him into subspace, and those wibblies weren't yet gone. Trying to do more science to it all and keep him here failed, and he disappeared again. Old Jake's starting to struggle, not just with the story, but physically. His breathing is strained, and his guest suggests he continue this later. There is no later, though, as old Jake says he's dying, and he's not going to pass up the chance to finish this one last story. Efforts were made to track down Sisko again now that they knew he was alive. Repeating the events that caused it wasn't an option, as the wormhole wibbly only happened once every 50 years. They ran out of both options and time when the Federation gave DS9 to the Klingons. We'll assume the Bajorans agreed as a way of apologizing for siding with the Cardigans. And so Jake moved to Earth, lived near his grandfather, became a writer, became a husband, became happy. He even had visits from his old friend Eggnog, now a lieutenant commander, so they could talk about the old days. Things were a little calmer with the Klingons by this point, and they just agreed to let a Starfleet ship have a poke through the wormhole. DS9 was still there too, a little worse for wear and with Morn running the bar now, but there nonetheless. And it was after one of these visits, as Jake and his wife were off to bed for a bit of the old dirty little bastard, when Sisko appeared again. They called Starfleet to try and get some scientists over, of course, and Jake filled the weight by updating Sisko on developments in his life. Having a wife and 2 published books were the main ones, of course, but Jake overshadowed it all by apologizing for assuming that he was gone and not trying harder to help him. Sisko tried to tell him that he was being foolish, that seeing Jake have a life of his own mattered more. That comment might have carried more weight if Sisko hadn't disappeared as he was saying it. Old Jake is telling his guest that seeing his dad outside of DS9 changed things. He contacted Dax and they realized there must be a link between Jake and his dad caused by the warp wibblies that took Sisko away. And there was a pattern, too, one governed by the behavior of the wormhole. So he went to study science, which is why he only published 2 books. His dedication to learning about subspace wibblies was such that his marriage didn't survive. But he was successful and figured out a way to repeat the original accident, which was handy as it was approaching the 50-year anniversary, so the wormhole was getting ready for another bout of wibblies. Eggnog had made captain by this point and pulled some strings to get the Defiant out of storage. Worf pulled similar strings with the Klingons to visit the wormhole, them presumably still being in control of Bajor at this point. And Jake had constructed a flashy gizmo to do a science on the wormhole wibblies. Whatever it was supposed to do didn't work, and Jake was instead pulled away along with his dad. That gave them the chance to catch up some more, all while Jake tried to contact Dax with ideas on what to do, and Sisko was disturbed by what had become of his son. His last words were a plea to Jake to stop this obsession and try to rebuild his life. He was trying to get Jake to promise as much when the two of them were separated again, and Jake was returned to the Defiant to be consoled by Dax. It's near the end of the story for old Jake, but not the end of his stories. He abided by his father's wishes, you see, and wrote another collection. They aren't published, at least not yet, and he offers her a copy. She instead asks for the originals, the hard copies with notes. She wants to be a writer herself, and seeing his thought process will be useful. That they'll also be worth a few bars of latinum on future eBay is just a bonus. The story isn't quite over yet, though. Jake didn't give up on trying to save his dad, at least not straight away, and he figured out the connection between them is what drags his dad forward at predictable intervals. Severing the connection while Sisko was in subspace would lose him, but severing it while he was here. His guest understands what's happening and leaves after thanking him for his time and his stories. It's a little later as old Jake is napping when Sisko appears once more. He's pleased to see old Jake has started writing again, but less so at other developments. Old Jake explaining that he's the reason Sisko was being pulled forward has him worried, and finding the spray on his desk lets him put the pieces together. Old Jake reassures him that it's not an ending, though, it's a reset. Cutting the link now will return Sisko to the accident, and all he has to do is dodge the lightning. Well, that and be there for his son. It takes a second for Sisko to realize where he is before he dives on Jake to make sure the warp wibblies miss them both. Jake's confused by how he knew but seems to understand not to press it, so we'll leave Sisko to see the parts of Jake's life that he missed first time around, and possibly to consider how many people old Jake just deleted by resetting the timeline. Until the next adventure. Those of you who've been with us during the Voyager reviews will know I'm on record a few times as saying I don't care much for time travel stories, and the ones that have a big red reset button are generally the worst offenders for me. I say this not to warn you that I'm about to insult one of your favourite episodes, but because such a preface will allow you to understand what a compliment I'm paying when I say I would not change this episode. The relationship between Jake and his dad is something we've not seen much of for the last 3 years, an observation I mentioned last season when we finally got some in the episode Explorers. That was good, as long as we pay attention to the father-son stuff and ignore the MDF spaceship, and did a fair portion of the groundwork that this episode builds on. Jake's desire to become a writer is first fully established there, though you could argue we had a hint of it earlier when we heard Jake wrote poetry for Marder. Anywho, that episode is focused on Jake's worry about moving on with his life, not for his own sake so much as how it would affect his dad. Here we see a reversal of that and how the removal of Sisko affected Jake. You could even go so far as to theorize from the result we see here that much of Jake's hesitation before might not have been quite as focused on his father's well-being as he suggested. Seeing the damage done to Jake multiple times and, perhaps even worse, the legacy of that damage come back to ruin him again as a man, is heartbreaking. Let's be honest, a lot of the reason for the impact from that is Tony Todd, and I'm not just saying that because he passed a couple of months back. He's the inarguable star of this one and responsible for much of what makes it memorable. Everybody else does a good job, or at least good enough, but he owns every scene that he's in. The answer to why might lie in his personal life. During a Star Trek convention panel in 2014, he mentioned that he'd lost his aunt, the person who raised him as a child, 3 months prior to the filming of this episode. It doesn't take much to imagine why the parts resonated with him. And while we're on the topic of Tony Todd, yes, he's another member of the Babylon 5 crossover club, because of course he is. The man was quite prolific, so it shouldn't be much of a surprise that he popped up in one of the movies. Let's have a poke at some other bits in this one then, and I have 2 offerings for you today. The first is the mention of Jake's grandfather, specifically that he insisted Jake's wedding be held at his restaurant. Now, Sisko's dad has been mentioned previously, most notably in the Season 2 episode The Alternate. Whilst not explicitly stated, it was implied that he was dead during a conversation with Odo. Clearly somebody decided against it, as he's both alive and still cooking in an eating establishment that bears his name. Whether that was a conscious decision to give the writers even more ways to explore Sisko's family life, I don't know, but something that makes our hero characters more relatable is always a win. The second is a little thought experiment I'd like to conduct with you. In this episode, we're shown Jake's life as Sisko jumps through time, the end result being Sisko having advanced knowledge of a potential future and no other tangible changes to the universe. Now, everything we're shown makes sense and ties up nicely with a neat little bow of science bollocks, warp lightning and subspace and temporal anchors and all of that good stuff. But I can't help thinking it happened due to wormhole wibblies. And the wormhole is where those aliens who exist outside of linear time live. You know, the ones with prior form on giving people random visions. Did we viewers really just see Jake live his life and then end it to restore his father? Or did we see the prophets playing silly buggers again? End of episode.
I wonder how much he got paid for setting us up.
I'm gonna be honest with you, mate. If it were me, I'd have probably done it for a chill with Pringles.
Jesus Christ, is this what Tom Paris felt like when we were trying to screw him over?
Maybe, but he deserved it. We don't. Well, I suppose we'll have to deal with this dickhead then. And the alternate version of you, probably, while we're at it.
Oh shit, I'd forgotten about the other me.
Don't worry about him, he'll not be a problem.
What do you mean he won't be a problem? I've got databases full of information on weapons and anatomy. I know over 46 ways to kill someone with just a champagne cork.
I mean, if he's the same as you, then you'll not have to worry about any of that. Just put on a pair of glasses and he won't recognise you. Oof.